Hey guys, what's up? Today we're going to talk about allopatric and sympatric speciation. So what is speciation? Speciation is the process by which one species splits into two or more species. For example, the two species Panpaniscus, also known as bonobo, and Homo sapiens, humans, descend from a common ancestor. Having evolved into different species, we can't mate with primates due to the differences in body form and DNA sequences. Speciation eliminates the gene flow mechanism where members of the same species resemble each other less. There are many factors influencing speciation. One is reproductive isolation. This is the existence of barriers that prevent members of two species from interbreeding and producing fertile offspring. They step out of the gene flow where organisms rely on reproductive compatibility to resemble closely with those of the same species. This is speciation. There are two reproductive barriers: prezygotic, which prevents the fertilization of eggs, and postzygotic, which prevents the formation of fertile offspring. There are 5 types of prezygotic barriers which we will cover. First is habitat isolation, second is temporal isolation, third is behavioral isolation, fourth is gametic isolation, and finally, mechanical isolation. So what is habitat isolation? This is where species live in the same area, but very rarely encounter each other. Temporal isolation is where species breed in a different period of time, meaning they can't fuse their gametes. Behavioral isolation is when different species that are closely related don't attract each other due to the differences in their behavior. A common example of this is with birds, as each different species has a different mating ritual. Then we have gametic isolation. This is where gametes fail to fertilize. And finally, we have mechanical isolation. This is where members of the same species are unable to breed due to the differences in their body forms. A great example of this is with dogs. Chihuahuas and Great Danes are the same species, but, as you can tell, they're very different in shape and size. What are postzygotic barriers? This is when genes interact in ways that impair the hybrid development. A different number of chromosomes in parents results in abnormal gametes. Mutations in the parents affect the formation of gametes in the next generation. There are other factors that influence the formation of reproductive isolation. Allopatric speciation, which is very common, occurs when the populations become separated by geographical barriers such as mountains or rivers. The chance of breeding between these populations is reduced. Each gene pool is absent. Each population acquires mutation by natural selection to adapt to the new environment, and eventually the two populations reach a degree of genetic divergence where they can no longer interbreed. Here we have an example with trees. And here we have an example with fish, which also shows sympatric speciation. Sympatric speciation occurs when two groups of the same species live in the same geographic region, but they evolve differently until they can no longer interbreed and are considered different species. In evolutionary biology and biogeography, sympatric and sympatry are terms referring to organisms whose ranges overlap or are even identical so that they occur together, at least in some places. If these organisms are closely related, such a distribution may be the result of sympatric speciation. You have to remember that in sympatric speciation, there's no geographic constraint to interbreeding. Sympatric speciation events are quite common in plants, which are prone to acquiring multiple homologous sets of chromosomes, resulting in polyploidy. The polyploid offspring occupy the same environment as the parent plants, hence sympatry, but are reproductively isolated. Here's an example: the apple maggot flies. These flies only mated on hawthorn trees, but after apple trees were introduced into North America, they began to mate on the apple trees as well. Generally, the apple maggot flies that generally mated on the hawthorn trees continued throughout generations, as well as the apple trees. Thus, sympatric speciation occurred and new species were obtained.